All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. To begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Tishrei, to thank Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all of the shiurim and droshos this month in memory of their parents, to thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the shiurim and droshos this month in memory of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport, to thank Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe ben Avraham David. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Avron, Shaan, and Judah Elbaum, in the merit of Refua Shleima for Ami ben Chaya. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of those who have need a Refua will have one together with Kol Yisrael, all of the Neshamos will have an Aliyah, and the families a Nechama. And above with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Lamed Hey 35. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Lamed Dalit Amud Beis 34b, 10 lines up from the bottom. So remember, again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, because we were in the middle of a really fascinating discussion, which in Meretz Hashem we will continue and, God willing, conclude today, which is the concept of whether or not Shabbos is kova'as l'maiser. Meaning what? In a typical case, we understand that when does produce become subject to tithing obligations, to maiser, ultimately, again, you really need two things. Number one, the completion of the process. Complete a process. Processing is done. The produce itself is fully finished. And what we call ri'iyas pnei habayis, or ri'iyas hachatzer, coming into the courtyard of the home or coming into the home itself. Those are the two processes you need in order to trigger a meiser obligation. What the Gemara was dealing with is the possibility that maybe anything you're going to eat on Shabbos, by definition, is also subject to the meiser obligation. Now, what's the logic of that? So the Gemara quoted the pasuk, the karasa la Shabbos oneg, that says anything you eat on Shabbos is part of the mitzvah of oneg, which means that Shabbos. Actually, let me add in one more piece. The other piece is even if, let's say, the food is not fully processed and the food has not yet seen the entranceway of the home, even then you're only allowed to eat achilas arai, a snack. You're not allowed to eat achilas keva, a meal from untithed produce. The havamina the Gemara was operating with is that maybe anything you eat on Shabbos has the status of what? The status of keva. Status of keva, and therefore by definition, even if it's not fully processed, or even if it hasn't yet seen the home, halacha l'maisa, it should be subject to the laws of, to the obligation of meiser. So that's the theme we're continuing on today, and in Meretz Hashem, we'll see the halacha l'maisa as well on that. So Rav Nachman. So Rav Zuch said name Rav Nachman. Av anan nami tanina. We also learned as follows. Va'od amar Rabbi Eliezer omeid adam ala muktzeh erev shviyos. We'll say this is our Mishnah, right? What did the Mishnah say? A person could stand by his produce on Erev Shabbos during a Shemitah year. And remember again, Rabbi Eliezer said, what could he say? Mikan ani ochal lamachar. I'm eating from here. I'm eating from here tomorrow. Right? So the Gemara says, Taima, the Shiyas, the Labra is certain. Now the only reason this works is why? Because it's a Shemitah year. Because we'll say, what happens on a Shemitah year? What are you exempt from on a Shemitah year? Meiser. Right? There's no meiser obligation on a Shemitah year. So therefore, again, Rabbi Eliezer is setting up a very specific case where a person is standing by produce that is currently drying out. Right? It's being dried. And a person wants to go, and remember, that means ben hashmashas, it may be inedible. Now remember again, Hilchos Muktzah says that what? If something is unusable ben hashmashas, then what? It remains unusable for the duration of Shabbos. So what the person is doing is proactively setting aside something for use. Mikan ani ochal lamachar. From here I'm going to eat tomorrow. Now the only reason that works is because he doesn't have a problem. The only issue he has to contend with is what? The only issue he has to contend with is muktzah. What doesn't he have to contend with? Meiser. Because it's Shemitah. So which sounds like it's only because it's a Shemitah year that he doesn't have to worry about Meiser. But if it wasn't the Shemitah year, this setup would not work, because on Shabbos he could not eat without removing meiser, because Shabbos is koveya. Shabbos establishes a meiser obligation, but you can't tithe on Shabbos. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, but you see again, for the rest of the year, right, if it wasn't a Shemitah year, this would be problematic. What do you see? The Gemara says, "Hachanami d'aser, my taima lav mishum de Shabbos kava." So we'll say this seems to be a proof to the fact, to the statement that Shabbos itself triggers a meiser obligation, right? That even if produce is not fully processed, and even if there has not yet been a re'iyas pnei habayis of bringing it into the home, bekarasa l'Shabbos oneg, every act of consumption on Shabbos is considered to be achilas keva, a meal, and therefore Shabbos by definition triggers a meiser obligation. To which the Gemara says, so and we're just trying to prove that from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer sets up his case where I'm designating fruit that is currently drying for consumption on Shabbos, and the Mishnah Dafka sets it up as a case of Erev Shabbos during Shemitah. Why do you have to bring Shemitah into this? Oh, because Shemitah tells you there's no chiyuv of meiser, which tells you that had there been a chiyuv of meiser, this setup that Rabbi Eliezer is proposing would not have worked. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Lo, Shaindy Hasam Kelman Damar Mikanani Ochel Amachar Kava Le Iluye. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Maybe the issue over here is as follows. Even if this wasn't a Shemitah year, the truth is, here's the issue. What is the guy saying on Erev Shabbos, right? He's saying, Mikan Ani Ochel. Now, we saw Machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about how specific do you have to be in your designation. Okay, so believing that Machlokes aside, a person is actively saying, I'm going to eat this tomorrow. I'm going to eat this tomorrow. The Gemara suggests, Rabbi Eliezer suggests, that maybe Kava Le'iluye, that act of actively designating food that you are going to eat tomorrow on Shabbos, by definition, triggers a meiser obligation. In other words, but I want to be clear, nothing to do with Shabbos. It has to do with the fact that the moment you go ahead and you say, Mikan ani ochel, ultimately, again, that triggers a meiser obligation. The Gemara says, Ihachi might your Shabbos. So if that's the case, okay, even if I want to accept that assertion, so then why set up the case as a guy who's standing on Erev Shabbos and making that declaration? If indeed you are correct, that any time a person goes ahead and says, Mikan ani ochel, that creates a keva situation, triggers a meiser obligation, why set it up as Erev Shabbos? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Hakamash malon, the tevel muchan hu eitzel Shabbos, shim avar v'tikno metukan. Because we'll say, actually, the Mishnah is going to teach me another halacha, which is that technically speaking, it will say in general, there's an interesting discussion in halacha. If you do something that you're not supposed to do, right? I avid mahani, I avid lo mahani. If you do something illegal, do the repercussions of your illegal act create a new legal reality or not? Right? That's in general. We find that machlokes many times in halacha. Here's a perfect example. You're not supposed to take tithes on Shabbos. You're not supposed to take meiser. What if you did? Is the produce considered to be tithed? To which the Gemara says, yes. To which the Gemara says, the reason why the Mishnah is setting this up as a case of where you're setting aside something on Erev Shabbos is to teach you that tevel, untithed produce, is considered to be muchan on Shabbos, prepared for you. So does it mean muchan? That if you were to violate the law and to tithe the produce, the effects of your illegal act would be legally binding. Right? Amazing. So that's therefore again, the Gemara says that's why it's illustrating the halakha. So we'll say, so what we have over here, before we go on to Lam and Heb and Aleph, what we have over here so far is the Gemara telling me like this. The Gemara toying with the idea that Shabbos is koveya. Shabbos establishes a meiser obligation for any food you're going to eat on Shabbos, even if that food is what? Number one, not fully processed, and even if there has not yet been a re'iyas pnei habayis, right, to bring into the home. The Gemara wanted to prove that assertion from the Mishnah. All the Gemara just did is say, not sure you can do that from the Mishnah, right? Because the Mishnah, and the Gemara wanted the way the Gemara wanted to prove it from the Mishnah was because the Mishnah Dafka sets this up as an Erev Shabbos case during Shemitah, where there is no obligation of meiser during the Shemitah year. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. The only reason the Gemara set it up by Shemitah was to teach you a different halacha, that tevel is muchan hu legabe Shabbos. What does that mean? That although you're not supposed to tithe tevel on Shabbos, if you did it, technically it works. Top of Lamed Hey. V'halo mosro chozer. But there's a different issue over here, which is about say in general, the leftovers can be returned. Now, what does that mean? V'sham inon leiv the Rabbi Eliezer da'amar kol heicha de mosro chozer lo kava. Rabbi Eliezer has a general rule that whenever you take food and the leftovers of that food can be returned, that ultimately your act of consumption is not called keva, is not called achilas keva. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. We're going to illustrate this with a case in just a moment. But look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Heichi matzis lemimar dekviusa mishum deborehu v'halocha v'halo afilu nita harbe minatev al b'chol v'nosin lefanav demechse dekvi alei b'achil maruba." So let me tell you this outside. So the idea is this. This is fascinating. If you take food, you have a large pile of food. You take some of the food out, but you take it in a way that whatever you don't eat can be returned to the pile, or could be returned to the we'll use the word pile, then by definition that act of consumption is not called achilas keva. It's actually quite fascinating. In other words, achilas keva, the halacha is suggesting means you're taking, and whatever you think you're going to eat, and whatever you don't eat, what happens to it? Right? Whatever, it gets thrown out. Anytime you could take and return back, ultimately again that's called a snack. That's called achilas arai. So let me illustrate this with an example. The Gemara says, "Disnan hanotel zeisim min hama'atan." If a person takes olives from a vat, tovel achas b'melach va'ochal. So what can you do? You could dip them into salt one at a time, and you could eat them, and that's called achilas arai. That's called a snack, and you can eat it even if the olives have not been tithed. Vim tavel b'nasan lefanav asara chayiv. But if you took out 10 olives and you dip them all in salt at once, right? And there are 10 olives are sitting in front of you. Rabbi say, then what? Chayiv v'maiser. Why chayiv v'maiser? Why? Because apparently 10 olives are considered to be what? Right? Keva, a meal. And not only that, you can't what? You can't return it back to the vat. Why not? It's been salted. Good. So that's the rule. That's another rule in Hilchos Maiser, which is that halacha l'maisa, anything that is taken and can be returned, by definition is called achilas arai. Another example of this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, min ha'ma'atan tahar chayiv, min ha'ma'atan tamei pater. Rabbi Eliezer says, if you took it from a vat, which only houses tahar olives, then whatever you take from the vat, ultimately again, you're chayav in meiser. But if you took it from a vat which was tamei, right, the olives are tameim, then ultimately again, you're pater from meiser. Why? Mipneishu machzir es hamosar. Because you have the ability to return the leftovers. V'havinon ba. But we asked about this. I don't understand what that means. Maishno reishu, maishno zeba. What do you mean if the olive, if the vat is tamei, the vat is tar? What does that mean? Here we go. Reisha b'ma'atan tahar v'gavra tamei. The first case is talking about a case where the ma'atan vat is tahar, but the person is tamei. So we'll say, what happens if you're tamei and you take olives from a tahar vat? Can you return the remainder of the olives? No, because now they're tameim. You can't return the leftovers. Seifa, the second case is b'ma'atan tamei v'gavra tamei. But if the olives are tamei and the person is tamei, then what? The matzi mihadrele. You could go ahead and return the olives. Therefore, I will say, again, we're just trying to highlight a principle. And it happens to be, these are all fascinating principles in Hilchos Meiser, which I will say this idea that by definition, if you could take food from a larger collective group and eat what you want and return the rest, by definition, that's called arai. That's called arai. Now, what's interesting about that is, it even sounds like that's called arai, even if what? Or independent of how much you consume or how much you're returning, which is just interesting. In any event, so therefore we'll say, why does this matter to us? So the Gemara says, isn't this the case of our Mishnah? But say, remember again, what's the case of our Mishnah? What type of food are we talking about? Fruit that's drying out on the roof, or fruit that's drying out somewhere, right? So this sounds like a case where I could take and return. Right? Because remember again, bepashtos, we would assume that when you're drying out fruit, you take what you want, and let's say you're drying figs, and you took 5 figs and you only ate 3 of them. Bepashtos, you could go ahead and return it back. If you could return it back, by definition that says it's achilas arai. If it's achilas arai, then what? There's no Meiser obligation. If there's no Meiser obligation, you can't infer anything from the Mishnah about the power of Shabbos to trigger a Meiser obligation. Because the truth is, even though we're setting it up as a case of Erev Shabbos, it's not really the biggest deal that it's Shabbos, because it's Achilas Arai anyway, and you could return it. To which the Gemara says, Masnisin Nami b'muktset tahar v'gavra tame. No, our Mishnah is talking about a case, we'll say, of where essentially the produce is tahar, but the individual is tame. And therefore we'll say, if the produce is tahar and the individual is tame, then what? You can't return the leftovers. The lomatzi mehadrele. Ultimately, again, you can't return the produce. So therefore, again, don't bring up this topic, because this topic is inconsequential for our particular case. Valo muchzarin va'omdinheim. To which the Gemara says, but aren't they, look at Rashi, Parchina havalo muchzarin va'omdin, v'halo lo notlan ella Debar ba'amahu, v'cheivan dechinatlan ve'efsha b'chazara mahani lechazara, v'lo mikva, kilo efsha b'chazara nami, v'lo natlan ella dibura ba'alma, ve'ein lecha chazara, because we'll say, so ultimately again, to which the Gemara says, remember, this is a different kind of case. In this case, Rabbi said, Erev Shabbos, are you taking anything? No, all you're doing is dibura ba'almahu, right? It's just simple speech. It's a verbal designation. So this, the truth is, should be even a stronger case, because in the case where you're taking and returning, okay, you're actually taking. This case, it's only dibur. Ella, rather, Rabbi said, the Gemara says as follows. Rather, the Gemara says, Ella, Avraham seen about Ashi, Rabbi Eliezer ka'amrit, Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei. Rabbi Eliezer has a different svara. The Amar, Truma Kava, the Kol Shekin Shabbos. So we'll say this is very interesting. Rabbi Eliezer has a different approach. Rabbi Eliezer says the taking of Truma goes ahead and establishes an obligation, and all the more so Shabbos. I will say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's Rashi in the intermediate wide lines. First of them, Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei damer Truma Kavas, davar shelo nigmar malachto shemigbir Trumaso ne'asar la'achilas harai ad she'avta shamas. So this is very interesting. It says like this: if you separated out truma from produce that wasn't fully processed, halach l'maiser, the removal of truma by definition triggers the obligation for meiser. Okay, now the truth is we're not going to get into that discussion right now. We're more interested in the second part, which is Rabbi Eliezer is on record as saying that what? That halach l'maiser, Shabbos is also kovea. Truma. So if you separate out truma creates a meiser obligation, v'kol shekein Shabbos. And all the more so Shabbos. That will say, now, what's the logic of that? That if taking Truma triggers a Meiser obligation, certainly Shabbos, the mere Shabbos itself triggers a Meiser obligation from anything you're going to eat. So Rashi says, V'koshkein Shabbos, Techashiva achilasa. So I will say, because ultimately, this goes back to what we said before, because on Shabbos, every act of consumption is considered to be achilas keva. There is no arai, there is no snacking on Shabbos. Everything is considered to be achilas keva. Where do we know? So from this now, here we go. Perus shetarman achal nigmar malachton. If you have fruit from which truma was removed before the fruit was fully processed, Rabbi Eliezer oser le'achol mehen arai. Rabbi Eliezer says you can no longer snack from these. In other words, we're supposed to remember again, normally, before you separate out meiser, you're allowed to eat achilas arai. Rabbi Eliezer says if you separated out truma already, you can no longer eat achilas arai. V'cham matir, the chum say that it's mutter. Chum say that it's mutter. So we'll say what the Gemara wants to suggest is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, if Rabbi Eliezer holds that truma triggers a meiser obligation, right? If you remove truma from unprocessed produce, that triggers a meiser obligation. Then all the more so Shabbos, when you eat from unprocessed produce on Shabbos, that will trigger a meiser obligation. The Gemara says, Tashma miseifa, but look at the seifa. V'chachamim omrim ad shi yirshom v'yormi kan v'ad kan. The Chacham say, back in our Mishnah, the Chachamim say that halacha l'maisa, they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. And whereas Rabbi Eliezer allows you to say, mikan ani ochel, from here I will eat. And he makes that general statement. The Chachamim say you have to actively demarcate where you're going to eat from. Taima de Erev Shabbos b'shviyas. The only reason that he has to do this is because the only reason this works is because this is an Erev Shabbos during the Shemitah year, and during the Shemitah year, Meiser obligations don't apply. The Gemara says, "Delav bar Yisurihu, ha b'shar shanei shavua." But if you would do this in any other year, tibnei Yisurininu, where you would have to take Meiser Asurim, ultimately it wouldn't work. Why? My taima lav mishum de Shabbos kava. The reason it wouldn't work during a non-Shemitah year is because, again, you would have to take Meiser from this produce before consuming it on Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, Shaindy Hasam kevan davar mikan va'ad kan ani ochel lamachar kavale." No, it could be different. I will say, even if you hold that Shabbos doesn't generate a Meiser obligation, when you make a declarative statement that says, "From here until here, I am going to eat," that makes your act of consumption into an achilas keva, and therefore triggers the Meiser obligation. Ihachi, if that's the case, my area Shabbos afilu b'chol nami. So if that's the case, then why set up this case as a case of Erev Shabbos during the Shemitah year? Set it up as a weekday, right? Set it up as a weekday. To which the Gemara says, you're right, as we said before, HaKamash Malon, the Teval Muchan who ate al Shabbos, Shim Avar v'tikno mitukon. Because the Gemara is teaching me another secondary halacha, which is that Tevel is considered to be ready for consumption on Shabbos, and even though it is illegal to go ahead and separate out Meiser, if you did so, your illegal act would create positive legal consequences. Namely, again, that the produce would be mu'usr, would be tithed. Or minhi, so raise a kash. So again, we're still stuck in the same place, which is, what is the impact that Shabbos consumption has on untithed produce? Does Shabbos render every act of consumption into an achilas keva? In which case, even if the produce is not fully processed, and even if there has not been a re'iyas pnei abayis, you can't eat from it because Shabbos itself triggers a Meiser obligation or not? That's still the $1 million question we're trying to answer. We have not yet successfully answered it. So the Gemara goes weiter. Another case. Or minhi, haya ochal be'eshkal v'nichnas migina l'chatzer. Both say, interesting case. If you're eating a cluster of grapes, they both say, what's the status of grapes in terms of hilchos maisrus? So if you look in the wide lines of Rashi, 3 lines down, it's very interesting. Haya ochal be'eshkal, ustam eshkal, lav gimar melochahi, Distam anovim ledricha kaimi. Rabbi say this is fascinating. In the Gemara's view, a cluster of grapes is an unfinished product because the majority of grapes are used for wine. Again, this obviously is a societal designation as well, because again, I think we look at a cluster of grapes as a finished product. But from the Gemara's perspective, the majority use of grapes was to create wine, and therefore a cluster of grapes in halacha is looked at as unfinished produce. Okay, so now watch this. You're eating a cluster of grapes. V'nichnas migina lechatzer. And you walk in from your garden, from your field, into your chatzar. Now remember again. Now why is that halachically significant? Why is that halachically significant? Because remember again, the chatzar is what? The chatzar is what? Chatzar is one of the areas that triggers a Meiser obligation, right? Either bringing it into your home, bringing it into your chatzar. So now I'm walking, eating unfinished produce, eating a cluster of grapes. I walk in from the gina, from my garden, into the chatzar. The shaila now, of course, is what's my Meiser liability, if any? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar. So we're going to define what this means. But Bepashtos, Rabbi Eliezer says, finish up. Rashi says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar, in Ratza Ligmar Bechata Yigmar Chila. So the Ein Chatzar Kovah Stav Shalim Malachtos. We'll say what it sounds like is happening. Rabbi Eliezer says, it's fine. You could continue to eat your grapes. Why? Because bringing unfinished produce into a chatzar does not trigger a Meiser obligation. The only thing that triggers a Meiser obligation is what? Bringing finished produce into your chatzar. But unfinished produce in your chatzar, keep on eating. Rabbi Yeshua Omer lo yigmar. Rabbi Yeshua says you may not continue to eat. Okay? So it sounds like what Rabbi Yeshua is saying is, even bringing unfinished produce into the chatzar triggers the Meiser obligation. Okay, that's part 1. Part 2. Chashcha b'leilei Shabbos. What happens if again you're eating these grapes on Erev Shabbos, you bring them into your chatzar, and now it's Shabbos night. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar. Rabbi Eliezer says you could still finish the grapes. Rabbi Yeshua Omer lo yigmar. And Rabbi Yeshua says you cannot finish the grapes. Can't finish the grapes. So I will say, so bepashtos, look at Rashi just a moment. So hachigar sin chash chalei Shabbos yigmar. In Ratzah ligmar ki hechi darn bechatzar amar b'Shabbos yigmar chaz de'in Shabbos kovas davar shlo yigmar malat. So I will say, sounds like over here that what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is the same way that your chatzar does not trigger a meiser obligation for what? For non-fully processed produce, Shabbos also doesn't trigger a meiser obligation. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says, Shabbos, finish the cluster. Rabbi Yeshua says, the same way that your chatzar triggers a meiser obligation, even for unfinished produce, unfinished processed produce, so too does Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, so that's a pretty explicit, this is pretty, Rabbi Eliezer holds that Shabbos is not koveya. To which the Gemara says, Hasam kidiktani taima, Rabbi Nasan Omer, lo kisham Rabbi Eliezer yigmar b'chatzar, yigmar, rather, ela yotzi chutz l'chatzar v'yigmar. So we'll say, this is incredible. When Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm sorry. Taimad Rabbi Nasan, Omer, Rabbi Nasan really meant like this. Lo kishar Rabbi Eliezer yigmar b'chatzar. I disagree with Rabbi Eliezer who holds that you can finish it in the chatzar. Ela yotzi chutz l'chatzar v'yigmar. Rather, take it out of the chatzar and finish it in the gina. V'lo kishar Rabbi Eliezer yigmar b'Shabbos yigmar. Ela mantin memotzei Shabbos v'yigmar. To which the Gemara says, no. What it means ultimately is that one opinion is saying take it out to the chatzar, finish it in the chatzar. I'm not finishing it in the gina, not in the chatzar. And when we say ultimately yigmar, it means don't finish it on Shabbos, rather finish it on Motzei Shabbos. Kiyas Rabbi Yochanan, here we go. Echad Shabbos, ve'echad Truma, ve'echad chatzar, ve'echad mekach, kulon ein kovin ela b'davar shenigmara malachtan b'Shabbos. When Ravin came along, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan as follows. He said, whether it's Shabbos, the removal of Truma, bringing it into a chatzar, using it for commercial purposes, none of these things create a meiser obligation unless, of course, what? Unless, of course, the produce is fully processed. So I will say, it sounds like over here the Gemara is reaching a conclusion that halacha l'maisa, as powerful as Shabbos is, and as transformative as Shabbos is when it comes to consumption, when it comes to achila, even Shabbos cannot trigger a meiser obligation unless the produce has been fully processed. Now hold on to this. We're going to go through all of these cases and then we'll see the Rambam. Lafuke midei Hillel. And this comes to exclude the position of Hillel. Because what did Hillel say? Disanya hama perosi makom l'makom liktzar v'kidush yom. If a person piled fruit from one place to another place in order to allow the fruit to dry out and it becomes Shabbos, Amar Yehuda Hillel li'atzmo oser. Hillel said that halacha l'maisa, the produce is aser, right? When it says la'atzmo, means he was a das yochid, a singular opinion that the produce is not fit for consumption because Shabbos creates a meiser obligation and you can't tithe on Shabbos. Amud Beis, chatzar. What's the case of chatzar? La'fuki mid Rabbi Yaakov. That comes to exclude the case of. So let's remember again. Ravin is saying that Shabbos only establishes a meiser obligation if the produce is fully processed. That comes to exclude the position of Hillel, because Hillel holds that Shabbos can generate a meiser obligation even for non-fully processed food. Okay, next thing Ravin said is even when you bring your produce into the chutzar, a chutzar only generates a meiser obligation for what? Fully processed food. La'fugim with Rabbi Yaakov, Disnan, Hamavir te'ina bechatzera liktzos. If a person spreads out his figs in his chutzar for to dry out, Panov ubnei Beitzah ochen mehen arai uptur min hameiser. His family members could snack from the figs, and it's pater from meiser, which again, because it's not fully processed. V'tani Allah, Rabbi Yaakov mechayiv, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda poter. And we learned about this. Rabbi Yaakov says, no, you're chayiv. We'll say, now, why does Rabbi Yaakov say you're chayiv? Because Rabbi Yaakov holds that once the produce is in the chutzar, even if what? Even if the produce is not fully processed, the mere bringing it into the chutzar generates the meiser obligation. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, right? Truma, when Ravin said that halacha l'maisa, that truma that taking of truma, right? We had this case in Gemara. If you took truma out of unfinished produce, that does not generate a meiser obligation. Lafugim with Rabbi Eliezer. Disnan peiros shetarman achla nigmar malachton. If you took truma from produce that wasn't fully processed, Rabbi Eliezer oser mehen oser leachol mehen arai. Rabbi Eliezer says you can no longer snack from that produce. The Chachamim matir, and the Chacham say that it's mutter. So Rav is coming to exclude the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Good. Mekach. What's the case of using unfinished produce for in a sale transaction, a commercial transaction? Here we go. Halokiach te'inim ama'aretz. If you purchase figs from an ama'aretz, so we'll say ama'aretz in this context means what? Someone who's not versed in halachas of Trumas and Maasros. So what's the halacha? B'makom shirov b'nei adam darsin. In a place where the majority of people make cakes of pressed figs, ochel mehen arai, you can go and you could snack from these figs, asron demai, but you have to tithe them again as demai. Remember again, demai means questionable produce from an ama'aretz. Shmamina tlas, you learn from here three things. Number one, shmamina mekach ino kovas. Just because you purchase something doesn't automatically trigger a meiser obligation, unless, of course, the produce was fully processed. Interesting enough, I will say, you see from here that, in fact, interestingly enough, we assume that the majority of Amei Haaretz do tithe. The Gezerah of Demai is only there to be careful with the minority who do not. The reason we know that is because the lashon over here is ma'asrin demai. We take meiser from the demai. It doesn't say ma'asrin es aperos. Right? Ma'asrin es demai means we actually believe the majority of Amei Haaretz do tithe, but the minority who don't cause us to have to retithe certain things. Ushmamina ma'asrin demai ma'amei Haaretz. Afilu bedavar shlo nigmara malachto. And you see from here also that we go ahead and we take meiser from demai of an ama'aretz, even if it has not yet been fully processed. Lafukim yihad desnan, to exclude the following position. Hamachlif peiros im chavero, if you exchange fruit with your friend, zeh lechol v'zeh lechol, and both parties, Reuven and Shimon, exchange fruit, and both of them are going to eat the fruit. Zeh liktos v'zeh liktos, or they're both going to dry out the fruit. Or zeh lechol v'zeh liktos, or one is going to eat and one is going to dry out the produce. Chayiv, ultimately again chayiv in meiser. Yehuda Omer leechol chayiv liktos pater. Yehuda says no. The only time we ever generate a meiser obligation is when you're going to be engaged in an act of consumption of achila. But if you're just going to put it out to dry, there is no meiser obligation. So I will say, how do we paskin? Right? Because again, at the end of the day, let's emerge with a piece of halacha l'maiser over here. So I will say, this is in Hilchos Meiser, in the Rambam, Perek Gimel Halacha Gimel. Gimel Hilchos Meiser. And here we go. I will say, this is actually a good halacha to know. Ve'echad mishisha dvarim koveh l'maisros. Any of the following 6 things create an obligation to take meiser. Any of the following 6 things trigger a meiser obligation upon produce. Number 1, ve'eluhein. Here we go. Habayis, bringing produce into the home. Hamekach, going ahead and engaging in a transaction with produce. Ha'esh, cooking it. Melach, salting it. Truma, taking truma from the produce. And Shabbos. But, very important qualification, v'kulan ein koven ela b'davar shenigmara melachto. So what's here have in the Rambam paskins that halacha l'maisa, all of these 6 things. So working backwards, remember again, we were super focused on Shabbos. And what we wanted to know essentially was, could Shabbos go ahead and generate a meiser obligation on produce that was not fully processed? And the answer to that question is no. Shabbos is powerful in that Shabbos, we'll say, here's what happens with Shabbos. With Shabbos, halacha l'maisa, again, there's no achilas arai. So anything you eat has the status of keva. So even when during the week you'd be able to go ahead and snack on something without having to take meiser, Shabbos doesn't allow you to do that. But I will say, but halacha l'maisa, bringing meiser into the home is only triggers a meiser. Bringing produce into the home only triggers a meiser obligation if the produce is fully completed. Transaction, cooking, salting, truma, all of these things only trigger a meiser obligation if the fruit is, or if the produce is fully processed. Good, I will say, that is the halacha l'maisa, hadron halacha mevi, mazel tov, brand new parak. Mashilin peros derech haruba b'yom. So it's an interesting case. Still with the drying, not shumas l'maisros now, but still with the drying out of the fruit. So the imagery is the same. You have spread fruit out to dry on your rooftop. So now what happens, I will say, you want to go ahead and, we'll see, let's say it's about to rain. So you want to go ahead, you don't want the produce to get wet. So what do you want to do? You want to push the produce into your home. So you have a skylight. Remember, I will say they're operating with a flat roof. So you have a flat roof with a skylight. My fruit is sitting on top of my roof. So the Mishnah says, Mashilin peros derech haruba. Halacha l'maisa, you could lower the produce through the skylight. Lower the produce through the skylight. B'yom tiv, aval lo b'Shabbos. You can do this on Yom Tiv, but you cannot do this on Shabbos. Umechasim peros bekelim me'adlav. Similarly, again, if you have produce that is sitting on the roof, and let's say there's water dripping, or this, actually I take that back, this doesn't even have to be on the roof, this could be in your home. The point over here is you have produce dripping, you have water dripping on the produce. You can go ahead and cover your peiros with kalim, right? You can go ahead and cover your fruit with some type of kli in order to prevent it from getting ruined. Now, both say we're going to see what's the chiddush in that. Remember, again, both say we have the opinion of Rabbi Nechemiah, which again in the Hilchos Muktzah world we often don't reference because we're more focused on Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Nechemiah holds that what a kli can only be moved for what purpose? For a specifically designated useful purpose. So, and any other usage will be tircha yisera. So the Mishnah teaches we don't pass in that way. And halacha l'maisa, you can move a kli to cover your produce so it doesn't get ruined by the dripping wine. V'chein kadei yain, the kadei shemen. Same thing with, did I say dripping wine? Right, dripping water. Sorry. Right. V'chein kadei yain, the kadei shemen. So too, if you have jugs of wine or jugs of oil, and there's water dripping on it, and you want to protect them, you could place a kli on top of them. V'nostin kli tachas hadalaf b'Shabbos. So what else can you do? Let's say you have a leak in your roof. You can go ahead and place a kli underneath that roof. Now, both say, remember again from Smichas Chaver, we learned that in Hilchos Muktzah. What's the issue involved there? Little chazara. Good. I'm sorry. So it could be an act of stira. Good. It's mevatal kli mehechano. Right? Ultimately, again, you're negating the kli from being useful anymore. So whether that's stira, good. We'll see this sugya Mirz Hashem. Okay, so we'll say that's the Mishnah. So itmar Rabbi Huda Rab Nasan chad tani mashilin v'chad tani mashilin. So the first thing we're going to do, interestingly enough, is spend a little bit of time on linguistics, right? On the word choice. So remember again, the Mishnah said mashilin peros derech haruba, which means that you could lower fruit through the skylight on Yom Tiv. So the Gemara is just talking about the word use. So chad tani mashilin, one version had the word mashilin, v'chad tani mashchilin. The Gemara says, Amar Mar Zutra, man de tani mashilin lo mishtabish, or man de tani mashchilin lo mishtabish. Mar Zutra said, the truth is, either word works. We're going to see they both mean the same thing, which is to lower. Man de tani mashilin lo mishtabish. So the one who says mashilin, that works. Why? Dichsiv ki, because he quotes over here the pasuk in Devarim. The pasuk says ki yishal zeisecha. Ki yishal zeisecha. So the way we translate that is that the tree will throw down its fruit. Ki yishal zeisecha. So we'll say therefore mashilin is borrowed from the biblical lashon, is borrowed from the yishal. Uman detani mashchilin lo mishtabish. The one who says mashchilin is also not mistaken. Why? What does mashchilin mean? So the Gemara says disnan hashachol v'hakosel. So we'll say the pasuk over here, or the Gemara over here, is talking about different mumin in an animal. And what's shachol? Shachol shenishmata yirecho. Shachol means the animal's hip was dislocated. So we'll say, so the imagery there is the hip came out of its socket and went down. See, so mashchilin is also a lashon of falling down. Kasol she'acha meirekosav giva mechaberta. So kasol is just one of the hips is harder than the other. Fine. The point we'll say is that whether you want to use mashilin or mashchilin, both are correct. Amar Nachar by Yitzchak, man detani mashirin lo mishtabish. The Gemara says, uman detani mashchirin lo mishtabish. Uman detari manshirin lo mishtabish. So it comes along Rav Nachman and says, by the way, whether you use mashirin mashchirin, or menashrin. All of those words are correct as well. They all mean falling down. Manditani mashirin lo mishtabesh disnan. Say if you use mashirin, it's not incorrect. Why? Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Nazir lo yachov rosha ba'adama. A Nazir cannot wash his head with earth. Right? In other words, I guess use earth as a type of shampoo. Why? Because it'll cause hair to come out. So you see, mashir, Abosai means what? Something to fall out. Right? Fall out and fall down. And the one who says mashchirin is also not mistaken. Disnan, hashachar v'hazug shalasaparim. Abosai shachar is a razor. Zug are scissors. Afa pisha nechlaku tmeim. What says dahilchas tumas kelim? Even if the parts of the kli became detached, thank you, from one another, they still have the ability to go ahead and become tameh. So we'll say, we care about tumah, but for our purposes right now, the point over here is that a razor is called the shachar. Now what does a razor do? Right? It removes hair and the hair falls down. That's the idea. So that's why if you have lashon of mashchirin, it works as well. Uman detani minashrin, or menashrin, lo mishtabish disnan, misha nashru kelav b'mayim, mahalich bahen ve'ino choshesh. So we'll say an interesting case, right? If somebody's clothing became soaked with water, we had this in Malabim, as we learned, if somebody's kelim becomes soaked with water, ultimately again, mahalich bahem, you could walk in them, you could continue to walk in them, ve'ino choshesh. So we'll say, Rashi says over here, mahalich bahem, ve'misnagvin v'holchin, ve'ino choshesh shiachshadu shekabsan. So I'll say, remember again, we had this case in a little bit of Chazar Smichas Chaver. So you could go ahead and you could wear it. And what the Gemara actually is highlighting over here, something very interesting, which is, we're not concerned about marasayin. In other words, if someone sees me wearing a wet garment, let's say, well, I got stuck in the rain, and now the sun's out, someone's going to see me wearing a wet garment, the Gemara says, what could they suspect? That I laundered the garment. The Gemara says that we're not choshesh. We're not choshesh. Ultimately, again, that halacha lamaisa, we're not choshesh that somebody will think that I laundered the garment. Good. So we saw, by the way, in Smichas Chaver, we saw that there's an additional issue of wearing wet clothing, which could be an issue of what? Of schita, right? Of schita. But again, normally we're not sorry about schita because it's real for a variety of different reasons. I mean, the Gemara says as follows. So the point of it I will say is that now the lashon of menashe means the rain ultimately comes in, right? The rain comes in, and then the rain also comes out of the garment. There is no concern. So you see again, the lashon of menashrin is also a proper lashon. Inami mehadisnan ezehu leket. What's leket? Hanosher b'shas katsira. It is grain that falls out of my hand during the time of harvest. So I'll say, so the point is you have a whole bunch of different, so the point the Gemara is making us aware of is that there are many different versions of this Mishnah that use different opening words to highlight the same dynamic, and it's absolutely fine. Beautiful. So Tnan, we'll say let's go a little bit weiter. So Tnan, Mashilin Peros Derech Aruba, you can go ahead and lower the produce through the skylight on Yom Tiv. Ad Kama. I will say, here's an interesting shaila. The interesting shaila is, how much produce do you have the ability to go ahead and lower? In other words, I will say, the Mishnah just says you could lower produce through the skylight. So the shaila ultimately is there a cap? Right? Is there a certain amount you're allowed to go ahead and lower, and no more than that? So we'll say, listen to this. So ad kamo. So the Gemara says, we'll have another example of this. Mifanin arba v'chamish kupo shel teven v'shel tevua mipnei archim neim bitl beis hamedrash. So we'll say, let's say the following situation: you're having company over, or for that matter, again, you're giving a shiur. You want to learn in the beis hamedrash, but there are baskets of hay of straw. So what's talacha? You're allowed to move up to 4 or 5 baskets of straw in order to make room for your guests, or in order to go ahead and make room in the beis medrash. So that's giving us a shear. That's giving us an amount for the amount of straw that one is permitted to go ahead and move on Yom Tiv. So b'pashtos, maybe we should say it's also 4 or 5 baskets worth. That's the amount you can move. V'dilma shani hasam. Well, no, maybe that case is different. Why? Di'ika bitl beis hamedrash. Because I will say there's a real need. In other words, I need the space. I need the space for my guests. or I need the space for people to learn the Beis Medrash. Aval hacha deleka bittul Beis Hamedrash lo. But in this case over here, where I don't need the space, maybe again I'm capped at a much smaller amount. Inami hasam hainu time medarim v'chamesh kubo shari mishum Shabbos dechamira v'lo asi lezalzulei. Furthermore, again, maybe in the case of the 4 or 5 baskets of straw, that's permitted. That was the case of Shabbos. And by Shabbos in general, we're not worried that if we allow you to do something, you're going to come then to take shortcuts with the rest of Shabbos as well. Because Shabbos in general is considered to be very chamer. However, aval Yom Tiv dikil v'asila zalzulebe klal lo. But maybe on Yom Tiv, where we're concerned, since Yom Tiv already has certain kulas, we're concerned that if we allow you to move so much produce, you're going to come to take other liberties with Yom Tiv, then maybe we should cap you at a much, much smaller amount. Inami le'idach gisa, or maybe there's another possibility. What's the other possibility? Hasam hainu taima deleka hefsid mammon. Say by the case of Shabbos. So remember again, just to point out what's happening over here. We have 2 cases. Our Mishnah says you could lower produce through the skylight in the window. What doesn't the Mishnah say? How much produce? I'm comparing that now to another case in Shabbos. The case in Shabbos is if I have baskets of straw and I left baskets of straw in my dining room, I can go ahead and move it in order to accommodate guests. Or I left baskets of straw in the Beis Medrash, I can move it in order to go ahead and make room in the Beis Medrash. So we'll say, if you take a look at Rashi just a moment, by the way, Rashi says over here, actually, no, don't worry. So now the shaila is, should I take the amounts by Shabbos and apply them to Yom Tiv? To which the Gemara kind of equivocates and goes back and forth and makes arguments in both ways. The last part the Gemara says is as follows. Inami le'idach gisa, hasam hainu taima deleka hefsid mammon. Maybe I could say the reverse argument. So the Gemara just wanted to say, well, maybe you could only move 4 or 5 baskets by Shabbos because in general people are more vigilant by Shabbos than they are by Yom Tiv. But if you allow people to move that volume of produce, 4 or 5 baskets amount, by Yom Tiv, oh boy, what they're going to do, how they're going to trample on the sanctity of Yom Tiv. Now the Gemara goes in and makes a reverse argument. Inami, lidachkis, I can argue the opposite way. Hasam hainu taima deleka hefsid mammon. In the Shabbos case, there's no financial loss, right? In the Shabbos case, why am I moving the straw? Why? I need the space. It's a space issue, right? But there's no financial loss. Aval hacha deika hefsid mammon afilu tuvanami. We'll say now the Gemara makes the counter argument that maybe over here by Yom Tiv, remember, why am I moving produce? The Gemara doesn't say it explicitly, but I understand contextually, why am I moving produce? Why? Because it's about to rain, right? I'm moving produce because at the end of the day, I am concerned that halacha lemaisa, it's going to rain and stuff is going to get ruined. The Gemara suggests maybe, because the case of Yom Tov has an element of financial loss, maybe I should even be able to move more produce. In other words, Shabbos is a case where I need the space. Space, you're limited to 4 or 5 baskets of straw. Yom Tiv, where there's financial loss, maybe I should be able to move more produce in that. We'll stop over here for today. I'm leaving you with this question. We'll pick up a Mir session tomorrow with the continuation of the discussion. How much produce are you allowed to move through the skylight on Yom Tiv? Shkoyach. I will say tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. We begin at 5:45 in Mir session tomorrow and Thursday. I'll send it out on the chat as well. Thank you.